The easiest way to catch a thief is to let him think you're asleep. In my company at my age, they call asleep senile. They see the old lady in the corner and think I'm just a piece of furniture. So I play the part. I forget names. I misplace my notes. And I accidentally left my life's work open on my desk for the ambitious new hire to steal. He's presenting it to the board today, smiling. He doesn't know I filed the patent 6 weeks ago. The air in my lab always smelled of ozone and damp soil. The ozone came from the mass spectrometer in the corner, a machine I had helped install in 1998. The soil came from the row of African violets I kept on the windowsill, the only spot of color in the sterile white room. I was adjusting the hydrogel feed to a test cell, my pen hovering over my notebook. The notebook was black, cloth-bound, and filled with 40 years of my handwriting. Every formula, every failure, every small breakthrough, recorded in blue-black ink. The lab door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, breaking the quiet hum of the ventilators. I did not look up. I finished my notation. V in, faire, Dr. Thorne? The voice was new. It was too loud for the space. It vibrated with a confidence that had not been earned, only supplied. I placed my pen in the notebook's gutter and turned. He stood in the doorway, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. He was young, with a sharp haircut and the kind of aggressive white smile I saw on corporate posters. He held a tablet in one hand. "I'm Gavin," he said. He did not move to shake my hand. "The new optimization analyst." "Dr. Eris Thorne," I replied. I closed my notebook. His eyes scanned my lab. They passed over the spectrometer, lingered on my workstation with its ancient hard-line terminal, and settled on my row of plants. "Quaint setup you have here," he said. He stepped inside, and the smell of his cologne, a sharp, woody scent, cut through the ozone. "I'm with the new transition team. We're auditing all R&D assets, trying to see where we can streamline." He walked over to my main workbench, tapping his tablet. "This is your division?" "This is my lab," I said. "I am the division." He gave a small, tight laugh. "Right. That's one of the things we're optimizing. The CEO wants to consolidate personnel. You've been here a while, right?" 40 years, the file said. 41, in June, I said. "Impressive." He did not sound impressed. He sounded like a doctor looking at a patient chart. "Look, Eris, can I call you Eris? The board feels we have a lot of dead wood in the legacy departments. People who are just, coasting to retirement." My hand rested on my notebook. The cloth cover was smooth under my fingers. "I am not coasting, Gavin," I said. "I am working." "On what?" He gestured to my desk. "I looked at your output logs. Your last patent filing was 7 years ago. This is a high-tech company, not a botanical garden." He nudged one of my violets with his tablet. "My work is complex," I said. "It requires time." "Time is what we're auditing," he said, his smile bright and empty. "I'll be shadowing your division this month. My report to the board will determine, the optimization process." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Between us, Eris, I'm looking for a home run. A big project I can take to the board that proves this new model works. Right now, your lab, this isn't a home run. This is a bunt. And you're not even swinging." I said nothing. I just watched him. He pushed himself off the workbench. "I'll be back. I need to see everything. All your active projects, all your data." His gaze fell on my closed notebook. "I'm here to clear out the clutter, Eris," he said. "Starting with all this." He walked out, the hiss of the door sealing the silence behind him. I looked down at my notebook. My work was not clutter. It was a weapon, and he had just told me exactly what he was looking for. Gavin was a constant metallic presence. For 2 weeks, he shadowed me. This meant he sat in the corner of my lab, tapping on his tablet, his sighs filling the air whenever I stopped to record an observation in my notebook. He was loud even when he was silent. "Eris," he'd say, not looking up from his screen. "Do you really need to calibrate the mass spec every morning? Seems redundant." "I trust my instruments only when I have verified them," I said, not turning. "I trust my data only when I trust my instruments. We have an AutoCal protocol for that. It's in the cloud. Saves about, 40 minutes a day. The cloud does not account for atmospheric humidity in this specific lab. Gavin, my hands do," he huffed, a sharp sound, and went back to his tapping. He was always snooping. When I went to the washroom, I would return to find my desk chair angled just slightly differently. When I was running a diagnostic, I would see him from the corner of my eye, walking past my workbench, his gaze lingering on my notebook. He was looking for the home run. I had been working on it for a decade. A new compound, a revolutionary energy storage material that was stable, cheap, and could hold a charge 100 times longer than lithium-ion. I called it ageism. My notebook was filled with the formulas. My terminal held the simulations. He just needed access. On the 15th day, the opportunity came. An automated alert pinged on my terminal. It was a false alarm, of course. I had programmed it myself. The alert flashed red. Critical error, server room 3, coolant pump 4B. I stood up from my stool, perhaps a little too fast. "Oh dear," Gavin looked up, annoyed. "What now?" "The coolant pump. In server room 3, I said. I let my voice sound thin, worried. It's a very sensitive piece of equipment. I have to go, physically. It's an old system. It needs—" Well, you know, I let the sentence hang, as if I had lost the words. I bustled toward the door, deliberately clumsy. My elbow brushed my desk. The black notebook, which I had left open to page 114, the core chemical equation for ageism, was nudged toward the center of the desk. "Don't touch anything, Gavin," I said. "Especially the spectrometer. It's finicky." I hurried out, the lab door hissing shut behind me. I did not go to the server room. I went to the observation corridor, a dark hallway with a one-way mirror that looked directly into my lab. It was designed for monitoring volatile experiments. I watched. Gavin waited 30 seconds. He stood up, walked to the door, and checked the corridor. He could not see me. He moved quickly then. He went to my desk, pulled out his phone, and held it over the open notebook. I heard the faint digital click of the camera. Once, twice, a third time for the next page. He closed the notebook. He sat back down at his corner desk, his leg jiggling. I waited 5 minutes. I reappeared, patting my chest. Oh my, all that fuss. The sensor was just dusty. I just had to blow on it. He smiled at me. It was the smile a person gives a small, harmless child. "Good job, Eris. You handled it." He thought he had the formula. But the formula was useless without the simulations. An hour later, I was struggling at my terminal. I sighed loudly. "This new interface," I said, clicking my mouse. "I just can't find the budget files." "You said you needed the budget files for your audit?" Gavin stood up, his patience gone. "Just give me the terminal, Eris. I'll find them." "Oh, would you?" I said. "Thank you, dear." I logged in. My password was complex, but I typed it slowly, as if by rote. The screen opened. The budget files were in one window. Minimized, but clearly visible in the taskbar, was another. Aegis Cell Simulation Feat for 2. I need my good pen, I said, standing up. I think I left it in the break room. The one with the vending machine. Yes. I shuffled out of the lab again, leaving him logged in. I returned to the observation corridor. He was at my terminal. He didn't even look for the budget files. He clicked the Aegis Cell window. He stared at the screen, his mouth open. He saw the graphs, the projected revenue, the technical specifications. He saw his home run. He pulled a small black USB drive from his pocket and jammed it into the port. A small click. A light on the drive flashed as it copied my life's work. He yanked the drive out, minimized the simulation, and clicked on the budget spreadsheet. When I walked back in 3 minutes later, he was standing by the window, looking at my violets. "Find your pen, Aris?" he asked, his voice smooth. I looked at my terminal. The screen showed the budget spreadsheet. I looked at my notebook, which was sitting closed on my desk. "No," I said, patting my lab coat pocket. I seemed to have forgotten where I put it. "A shame," Gavin said. He smiled, a real wide smile this time. "Don't you worry about a thing, Aris. I think I have everything I need." The lab was quiet again for the next few weeks. Gavin stopped visiting. He sent an email, a cold, short message, stating he had sufficient data for his optimization audit and that my physical presence would no longer be required at his check-ins. I continued my work. I calibrated the spectrometer. I tended my violets. I recorded my data in my black notebook, but I was also doing something else. I was logging every discrepancy. Every simulation I knew Gavin had stolen, I ran again, but with his optimized inputs. I watched his theoretical models fail. I watched them on my screen overload, destabilize, and burn. I saved these logs. The whispers started soon after. Project Apex, they called it. A revolutionary new battery, Gavin, the Wunderkind. He was presenting it to the board in 2 weeks. A full, formal presentation. My invitation arrived in my email. It felt like an afterthought. Dr. Aris Thorne, project consultant, legacy. The preliminary meeting was held in Conference Room B, a cold room that always smelled like industrial carpet cleaner. I sat in the back, my hands folded on my lap. Gavin was at the front, by the large screen, vibrating with energy. He wore the same expensive suit. "Good morning," he said, his voice booming. "Today I'm going to show you the future. A future I've built. I call it Project Apex." He clicked a remote. An image appeared on the screen. It was my work. My graphs, my cellular structure, but rendered in slick corporate blue and silver. He talked for 20 minutes. He used words like synergy, disruption, and fast track. I noticed he had removed all my safety protocols, all the gradual stabilization phases. He was pushing the material to a 0.60 vive input. I knew from 40 years of experience that at 0.60 vive, the aegis cell would fail. Not just fail, it would become critically unstable. He paused for a breath, smiling at the executives. "It's all thanks to the foundational, if slow, work of Dr. Thorne. She got us the baseline." "Aris?" All eyes turned to me. I blinked, as if waking up. "Aris," Gavin said, his voice laced with patronizing sweetness. "Can you confirm for the board? Your original baseline for the ion charge. It was 0.45 V, correct?" I looked at him. I looked at the CEO. I frowned slightly. The charge," I said. My voice was soft. "Oh dear, the ions." I tapped my temple. Was it 0.45 or 0.54? I'm sorry. I don't seem to recall the exact number. It's in my notes, I think. But I seem to have left my notebook. Gavin's smile tightened. He was annoyed. "It's fine, Aris. 0.45. It was 0.45. "Oh, was it?" I said, smiling vaguely. "Well, that's good." Gavin forced a laugh. "As you can see, the legacy data was a bit disorganized, but I've pushed past that. We're running at 0.60 V now. We've cut the charge time by 80%. An executive looked at me. "Dr. Thorne, is a 0.60 V input stable?" I looked at the executive, then at Gavin. I seemed confused. "Going 60? That sounds very, very fast. Very high. I'm not sure. I would have to check the thing." Gavin jumped in, his voice sharp. "It's stable, Mr. Harrison. My simulations are conclusive." He smiled at me, a smile full of pity. "Thank you, Aris. That's all we need from you." You can just listen now." The room's attention shifted back to him. They saw him as the energetic new leader. They saw me as the confused old woman he had to drag along. His belief that I was finished, that I was a senile relic, was now total. I sat quietly for the rest of the meeting. "Thank you so much." "Kevin," I said to him as we filed out. "It's Gavin," he whispered, his face tight with anger. "Oh, of course. My apologies," I said. I walked out of the conference room. I did not go back to my lab. I walked past my lab, past the elevators, and out the front door of the building. The air outside was cool, and it smelled of city exhaust. I raised my hand. A taxi pulled over. "Where to, lady?" the driver asked. "The Banneker Building, 1400 Federal Plaza." It was not the address of my home. It was the address of my patent attorney. I opened my briefcase, and my fingers found the smooth, cloth-bound cover of my real notebook. The one I had not left open on my desk. My lawyer's office smelled of old paper and lemon-scented wood polish. It was a quiet, solid room. It was the opposite of my lab. "Ms. Davis," I said, "thank you for seeing me on such short notice." "Iris," she replied. She was a sharp woman my age, with kind eyes and a steel-gray bun. "You said it was urgent. You're expediting." I did not sit. I stood at her desk and opened my briefcase. I took out my real notebook, the one with the reinforced spine, filled with 41 years of contiguous research. "I filed the provisional patent 6 weeks ago, as we discussed," I said. I opened the notebook to the final entry. "This is the supplemental data, the final stabilization sequence. It finalizes the ageism technology. It needs to be filed today. An emergency addendum." Ms. Davis looked at the equation. Her eyes widened just slightly. This is it. This is it," I confirmed. "And this is the only existing copy. I need the addendum filed, and I need to place an official inquiry with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Right now." She was already dialing her assistant. "Get Officer Chen at the USPTO on the line, priority." She looked at me. "An inquiry about what?" "Potential infringement," I said. "Tell him patent number 7924.8b, Aegis Cell Technology, is at active risk. Tell him the inquiry is being logged by the sole inventor, Dr. Aris Thorne." For the next hour, we worked. I signed documents. I verified my identity. I spoke to Officer Chen myself, my voice clear and precise. I explained, without using names, that a hostile entity was in possession of incomplete and stolen data, and that a presentation of a duplicate technology was imminent. "Your patent is secure." "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice tinny over the speakerphone, "the addendum is logged. The filing from 6 weeks ago is primary, and your infringement inquiry is now attached to the file. We'll be monitoring it." When I left the Banneker Building, the city air felt clean. The day of the board meeting, the executive floor hummed. It was a low electric sound I felt in my feet. I saw Gavin standing near the entrance to the main boardroom, accepting congratulations before the presentation had even begun. He was laughing, his white teeth bright against the dark wood of the hallway. I walked past him. "Aris," he called out. I stopped and turned, affecting a look of mild surprise. "Oh, Gavin, hello, it's your big day." He stepped toward me, lowering his voice. "Listen, Aris, after today, things are going to change. My Project Apex is the new flagship. The board, well, they're going to be optimizing the legacy departments, aggressively. He was telling me I was being fired." "I see," I said. I let my voice tremble just a little. I see," he smiled, a sympathetic, awful smile. "Don't you worry. I'm going to put in a good word. Make sure your retirement package is generous for all your foundational work." He patted my shoulder. His hand was heavy. The touch felt like a stain. "That's very kind of you, Kevin," I said. His smile vanished. "It's Gavin." "Oh, yes. I'm so sorry," I said, looking at the floor. "My memory." I shuffled past him and pushed open the heavy door to the boardroom. The room was full. The CEO, Mr. Harrison, was at the head of the long, polished table. The other board members were in their black leather chairs, their own tablets dark in front of them. Gavin walked in behind me, his energy filling the room. He plugged in his laptop at the front. "Thank you all for coming," Gavin said, his voice booming. I did not go to the table. I walked slowly to one of the chairs against the back wall. The guest chairs. I sat down, my spine straight, my hands folded on my briefcase. Gavin looked back at me, a flash of annoyance in his eyes. He clearly hadn't expected me to be in the room. He gave a small, condescending smile to the CEO. "And a special welcome to Dr. Aris Thorne," he said, "the grandmother of Project Apex." The board members gave me polite, dismissive smiles. "Let's begin," Gavin said, and the screen lit up. The screen behind Gavin glowed. The words Project Apex were written in a sharp silver font. Below them, a spinning animation of a molecule appeared. It was my molecule. "For 40 years, Gavin began, his voice smooth and practiced. "This company has been a leader. But in the last decade, we stagnated." His eyes flicked to me in the back row, a small, sad glance for the board to see. "We were trapped in legacy thinking. We were afraid to push boundaries. We were slow." He clicked the remote. A graph appeared. It was my 0.45V simulation, labeled Legacy Baseline. A flat, uninteresting line. "This," he said, tapping the screen, "was the best we could do. A 0.45-volt input. Timid, unprofitable. Safe, yes. But safe doesn't win the market. Safe doesn't get us to the future." I sat perfectly still. My hands did not move from my briefcase. I kept my breathing even. I watched Mr. Harrison, the CEO. He was leaning forward, his chin on his steepled fingers, listening to every word. "So I dug in," Gavin continued. "I found this forgotten research, and I asked a simple question. What if we stopped being afraid?" He clicked again. A new graph appeared. This one was a sharp, dramatic curve shooting toward the sky. It was labeled Apex 0.60V input. "This," Gavin said, his voice dropping with false modesty, "is what I achieved. I optimized the core. I re-engineered the containment field. I pushed the input to 0.60 volts. The result? A 1,000% increase in energy density. A charge time of under 10 minutes. This isn't an improvement, gentlemen. This is a revolution." He was lying. He hadn't re-engineered anything. He had simply stolen my simulation and changed a single variable in a text file. He had ignored the dozens of fail-safes and warnings I had programmed in. He was presenting a fantasy, a dangerous one. "This is impossible," one of the board members, a woman I didn't know, murmured. "The heat output at 0.60V would be contained," Gavin said, cutting her off. He flashed a slide of complex thermal diagrams. They were beautiful. They were also completely theoretical and ignored the laws of thermodynamics. They were art, not science. "My simulations are conclusive," he said. The same words he used in the preliminary meeting. For the next 20 minutes, he laid out his home run. He presented market projections, revenue streams, a full 5-year plan for Phase 2. He had already, I noted, put his own name on the departmental letterhead for the Apex division. My name was nowhere. I was not even a footnote. I was simply the useless old woman in the corner. The dead wood he had cleared away. My senility, which he had so readily believed, had been his justification. He finally arrived at his last slide. It was just the Project Apex logo again. "The future is here," Gavin said, spreading his arms. "And I have built it for you." A few of the board members began a low, polite applause. Mr. Harrison, the CEO, nodded, a slow, deep nod. He was sold. I could see the dollar signs in his eyes. Gavin's gaze found me in the back of the room. He was smiling. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was the smile of a thief who had just been handed the keys to the vault. He had won. He was still holding that smile, that look of victory, when the CEO's phone on the table began to vibrate. It was not a gentle buzz. It was a hard, angry rattle against the polished wood. The sound cut through the silence of the room. Everyone froze. Mr. Harrison looked at the phone, annoyed by the interruption. He glanced at the caller ID. His annoyance vanished. His face went white. He picked up the phone. "Excuse me," he said to the room. He pressed the speaker button. "Yes? Is this Mr. Harrison, CEO?" A voice said, sharp and official. "Yes. Who is this?" "This is Officer Chen from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office." Gavin's smile was gone. The room was so quiet I could hear the hiss of the air conditioner. Gavin stood at the front, his hand frozen on the remote. His mouth was still half open from his last word. "Mr. Harrison?" Officer Chen's voice said from the speakerphone. "Are you there?" "Yes," the CEO said. His voice was flat. "I'm here." "Good," the officer said. "We are calling to confirm the final approval of patent number 7924.8B. The title is Aegis Cell Technology. It was filed 6 weeks ago by its sole inventor, a Dr. Eris Thorne. Is she an employee of your company?" Every head in the room turned, not to Harrison, not to Gavin. They all turned and looked at me, sitting in the back corner. Gavin was a statue. The blood had left his face. He looked pale, almost green, under the fluorescent lights. "She is," Harrison said. His eyes were locked on me. "Excellent," Officer Chen said. His voice was crisp, professional. "We just received an inquiry for an identical technology under a different name. Project Apex, I believe. It was submitted for corporate review by your company. We wanted to alert the primary patent holder of potential infringement." Gavin made a sound, a small, dry gulp. He looked at the phone, then at me. His eyes were wide. He tried to speak. That's not—" I pushed my chair back. The sound of its legs sliding on the floor was loud. I stood up. My back was not bent. My hands were not trembling. I did not shuffle. I walked from the back of the room to the side of the long, polished table. I placed my briefcase on it and undid the latches with 2 sharp clicks. "Dr. Thorne?" Harrison asked. His voice was a strained whisper. Gavin shook his head, as if trying to wake up. "No, she's confused. She's old. She left her notes. I optimized it. I did the work." I looked at the speakerphone on the table. "Officer Chen," I said. My voice was clear. It was not the thin, wavering voice I had used for weeks. It was the voice of a scientist, the voice of an inventor. The room held its breath. "This is Dr. Thorne," I said. Gavin just stared at me. "Thank you, officer, for your diligence," I continued. "I can assure you, my company will be handling the infringement internally." I reached past Mr. Harrison and pressed the end call button on his phone. The room plunged back into silence. I turned my head and looked, for the first time, directly at Gavin. He was no longer a charismatic leader. He was a young, frightened man in an expensive suit, his skin slick with sweat. He was a thief who had been caught. The board members were all looking at me. Their expressions were no longer dismissive. They were not looking at a grandmother. They were looking at the owner of the company's entire future. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice calm. "Gavin has stolen my research." Gavin finally found his voice. It was a high, thin sound. "That's a lie! She's senile. Tell them. She gave me the notes." "Did I?" I asked. I opened my briefcase. I did not pull out a notebook. I pulled out a stack of printouts, 2 inches thick. "These," I said, placing them on the table, "are the logs from my simulation terminal. They show every access, every file copy, and every IP address. including the one for the USB drive Mr. Gavin used in my lab on October 14th. I placed a second stack next to it, and these, I said, are my real simulations. The ones showing that Project Apex at the 0.60 volts Mr. Gavin presented does not revolutionize energy. It explodes. The silence in the boardroom stretched. Mr. Harrison looked at the stack of simulation logs I had placed on the table. He picked up the top page, his eyes scanning the lines of code and the red error stamps next to every 0.60V entry. A lie, Gavin stammered. He pointed a shaking finger at me. She's faked this. She's a senile old. She's trying to sabotage me. Mr. Harrison looked up from the page. His face was no longer pale. It was a dark, dangerous red. Mr. Gavin, Harrison said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. You presented Project Apex as viable. It is. It is viable, Gavin said, his voice cracking. Her notes were just old. I modernized them. You presented, Harrison interrupted, a simulation that you knew was unstable. You brought a bomb into this boardroom and called it a battery. You lied to me. You lied to the board. No. Gavin looked around, desperate, searching for an ally. There were none. The board members who had been smiling at him minutes before now looked at him with cold disgust. Security, Mr. Harrison said. Not to anyone in particular, but to the room's intercom. Sir, Gavin tried. Give me your access card, Harrison said. Holding out his hand, Gavin stared at the hand. His whole body was shaking. He had built his entire future on this one theft, and it had just evaporated. He fumbled in his suit pocket, his aggressive confidence gone, replaced by the fumbling panic of a child. He pulled out his keycard and placed it on the table. 2 security guards, men I recognized from the front lobby, entered the room. They did not look at the board. They looked at Gavin. Mr. Gavin will be leaving us, Harrison said. Escort him from the building. I want his terminals locked, his accounts frozen, and a full audit of his work. All of it. You can't, Gavin whispered. We can, Harrison said. Get him out. The guards took him by each arm. He didn't fight. He looked for a final second at me. His eyes were no longer condescending. They were just empty. He was the dead wood now. The door clicked shut behind him. Mr. Harrison took a deep breath. He ran his hands over his face, then looked at me. He looked at me as if for the first time. Dr. Thorne, he said. He picked up the patent confirmation. Aegis cell. Is it real? It is, I said. And it is viable. But not at 0.60 volts. Not with the shortcuts he took. It requires patience. It requires my safety protocols. I gestured to the chair Gavin had just left. It requires my optimization. Harrison nodded slowly. He said you were not well. He saw what he wanted to see, I replied. He wanted a senile old woman he could steal from. So I let him. A few of the board members shifted in their seats. The woman who had questioned the heat output was now looking at me with sharp, focused interest. Dr. Thorne, Harrison said, I owe you an apology. And, congratulations. This is everything. He looked at the mess on the table. The Project Apex files, my logs, his phone. You, he said, will of course be heading up the new division. You can have Gavin's budget. Double it, whatever you need. Just tell us what to do. I looked at the CEO. I looked at the board. They were waiting. They were finally ready to listen. I walked back to my lab. The presentation was over. The executives were in a frantic meeting with the legal department. I slid the door open. The lab was quiet. The hiss of the door was a familiar, welcoming sound. The air smelled of ozone and damp soil. I walked to my workbench. I ran my hand over the hardline terminal that Gavin had thought was ancient. I looked at my violets, their purple flowers healthy under the glow light. I picked up my real pen. I opened my black cloth-bound notebook. I turned to a new page. My hand was steady. My name was Dr. Aris Thorne. I was the sole inventor, and I had work to do.